The night was cool and bright as Jake Thompson and his friends gathered at a local bar to celebrate the city's football team's victory. The atmosphere of euphoria was palpable, and the loud music pulsed, creating a vibrant atmosphere. Jake, a young man in his 20s, was at the center of the party, laughing and toasting with a glass full of beer in hand. "One more, Jake. You're the best defender I've ever seen," shouted Lucas, his best friend, as he raised his glass in a toast. Jake smiled, feeling invincible. The adrenaline from the victory was still coursing through his veins, and each sip of beer seemed to amplify that feeling of power. "Of course, let's toast one more time. Today is our day," Jake replied, raising his glass. The group laughed, and in an instant, more glasses were filled as the laughter and conversation mixed with the sound of the music. After a few hours, Jake felt light, almost floating. The worries of the world seemed distant, and he was surrounded by friends who admired him. He looked around, noticing the joy on his friends' faces, and an impulsive thought crossed his mind. He was unbeatable. "Hey Jake, want me to drive for you?" asked Raphael, one of the group's more cautious friends, with a worried look. Stop it. I'm fine, man. Just one more drink and I'll head home," Jake replied, waving his hand as if shooing away a fly. He didn't want to hear advice at that moment. The idea of being responsible seemed like a burden he wasn't willing to carry. After a few minutes, Jake decided it was time to leave. He said goodbye to his friends, who warned him once again about driving drunk. But their words sounded distant, like echoes in his mind. He left the bar, the cool night air hitting him like a bucket of cold water. As he got into the car, a sense of freedom washed over him. Jake turned on the radio and let the music fill the space. The drive home seemed long, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts of how perfect the night had been. He picked up his phone and distractedly began typing a message to a friend. "It was an incredible night. Let's do this again soon." What followed was a blur of colors and sounds. As Jake sent the message, he ignored the traffic signals that whizzed by him. The outside world became a haze in his intoxicated mind. He didn't notice the approaching intersection until it was too late. The impact was brutal, a sudden collision that made his heart stop for a second. Jake was paralyzed, his senses reeling in a whirlwind of horror. He saw the scene before his eyes in slow motion. The car that collided with his, the headlight going out, the sound of metal twisting. Reality disintegrated around him, and in an instant he found himself facing the devastation he had caused. "No, no," he murmured, his voice barely audible. The image of a woman lying on the asphalt, with a vacant, distant look, etched itself into his mind. His body moved as if to run, but something paralyzed him. The life of that woman, whom he didn't know, had been interrupted in an instant, while he was lost in his own illusion of invincibility. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake felt the weight of guilt collapse on his shoulders, but at that moment, all he could do was watch the horrific scene before him. Sarah's life being taken in a matter of seconds. The world, which had once seemed a place of celebration and joy, now became a labyrinth of regret and despair. The night that was supposed to be a happy memory was turning into a nightmare that had just begun to unfold. Jake Thompson sat in a cold, dimly lit room at the police station, the worn white walls seeming to close in on him as if they wanted to suffocate him. The sound of crumpling paper and the distant voices of police officers filled the room, but he could hardly pay attention. The only thing reverberating in his mind was the image of the accident, the deafening impact, and Sarah's desperate look. A woman he had never known but whose life he had destroyed in a matter of seconds. One of the police officers, a man with graying hair and a serious expression, entered the room. "Jake, we need to talk. You know why you're here, right?" His voice was firm, but there was a certain compassion that Jake could barely bear. I didn't mean to." Jake began to stammer, his hands trembling on the table. "It was just a moment of distraction. I didn't think that." "Everyone says that, Jake." The officer crossed his arms, looking directly into his eyes. "But the consequences are real. Mrs. Miller is no longer here, and you need to understand what that means." Those words cut like a knife. Jake felt the weight of guilt crushing him. He had never imagined that a simple glass of beer could lead to such a tragedy. Every moment, reality became more unbearable. He wanted to scream, wanted to hide, but all he could do was sit there, paralyzed by the pain. Meanwhile, outside the police station, the news of the accident spread like wildfire. The small town where Jake lived was soon filled with murmurs and sighs of sadness, the pain of Sarah's family echoing in every corner. He knew that their pain was not just a consequence of his actions, but a storm that was forming, destroying everything around it. "Do you know her family?" the officer asked, breaking the tense silence in the room. Jake shook his head, feeling like a stranger in his own life. He didn't know Sarah, but now he felt a deep connection to her suffering. She had 2 small children. What would you say to them if you could? The question made Jake choke. He had no words. How could he explain to a child that their mother would never come home again because of his recklessness? The weight of responsibility was like an anchor, pulling him down into his own guilt. Later, after the interrogation, Jake found himself wandering the streets of the town, memories of the accident echoing in his mind. Sarah's look, the sound of the crash, and now the image of her children, so small and innocent. The town was in mourning, and Jake was a spectator of his own life. He felt like a ghost, invisible and condemned. In a moment of weakness, he decided to visit the hospital where Sarah had been taken. The hope that maybe somehow he could do something to ease her pain was what moved him. When he arrived, his heart raced at the sight of Sarah's husband in the hallway. The man was leaning against the wall, his eyes red and swollen from crying. When their eyes met, a deadly silence took over the room. "Are you the one responsible for this?" His voice was a mix of anger and pain, and Jake felt his stomach turn. He couldn't look into the eyes of the man who had lost everything. The desperation and indignation were palpable, and Jake wanted to sink into the floor. "I'm sorry." The words came out of his mouth like a whisper, weightless, meaningless. He wanted to scream that it wasn't what he wanted, that if he could go back in time, he would change everything. But nothing could bring Sarah back. Sarah's husband just shook his head, a gesture that carried more meaning than any word. He walked away, leaving Jake paralyzed, unable to move. The emptiness in his chest was filled only by the pain of loss and guilt, a feeling that would accompany him for a long time. Jake looked at the ground, thoughts swirling in his mind. He didn't know how to live with it, how to deal with the reality he had created. Sarah's life and his own were intertwined in a way he could never have imagined, and with each passing day, the shadow of his mistake grew darker, more oppressive. Jake was sitting in a bar, surrounded by his friends, but the festive atmosphere had disappeared. The laughter and teasing no longer reached him. All he felt was an unbearable weight in his chest. He tried to force a smile, but it was as if the expressions on his friends' faces were distorted, as if everything around him was shrouded in a dense fog. As his friends toasted to life, he felt like a ghost, a shadow of the person he used to be. "Jake, are you okay?" Mike, one of his best friends, asked with a worried look. "You seem distant." "I'm just tired," Jake replied, trying to change the subject. "Come on, this is a victory. We should be celebrating, right?" "Sure. But you need to loosen up a bit, man. What happened that night isn't your fault. Come on, one more drink, and it'll all feel lighter," Mike insisted, raising his beer glass. Jake looked at the glass, feeling a wave of nausea. Those words echoed in his mind, but he knew that guilt wasn't something that could simply be washed away with more alcohol. He forced himself to laugh, but the sound came out dry, a joyless laugh. "Maybe later," he replied, looking away. He watched his friends laughing and having fun, and a deep sadness filled him. As the night went on, he decided to step outside for some fresh air. The cool breeze was a temporary relief. However, each breath was a reminder of what had happened. He remembered Sarah's face, the expression of panic in her eyes at the moment of impact. The image replayed in his mind like a terrifying movie he couldn't pause. He sat on a park bench, feeling the loneliness wrap around him like a heavy cloak. As he contemplated the city lights, Jake saw a group of people gathering on a nearby block. Curious, he stood up and approached. It was a vigil in Sarah's honor. Lit candles illuminated the night, and sadness hung in the air like a bitter perfume. Jake hesitated, feeling like an intruder in his own life, but something pushed him to get closer. He stood at a distance, watching Sarah's family, her young children holding flowers. Her husband, his face marked by pain, spoke about how she was always there to support everyone. "She was the light of our lives," he said, his voice choking with emotion. "And now, all of that is gone because of an irreversible decision." Jake felt his heart tighten. Those words cut like knives. He wanted to scream, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. He felt paralyzed, unable to move. The look on the children's faces, innocent and confused, burned into his soul. Those faces were the representation of what he had destroyed. "Why didn't you leave, you coward?" a voice whispered in his head. He slowly backed away, his head down, allowing the tears to stream down his face. He didn't deserve to be there, didn't deserve the peace his friends sought. Instead, he carried a burden he could never release. That night, Jake decided he needed an escape. He called his ex-girlfriend, Laura, hoping that a bit of familiarity might ease his pain. "Hi, Jake," she answered, a little surprised, but with a soft voice. "Are you okay?" "No, I'm not," he replied, raw sincerity in his voice. "Can I come over? I need to talk." Laura hesitated. "Sure, but Jake, you know I can't solve your problems." "I know," he said, almost pleading. "I just need someone to listen." When he arrived at her apartment, he felt a mix of hope and despair. Laura was there, but something had changed. The connection they once had seemed distant, like a memory of a happier time. They sat on the couch and Jake began to talk about that fateful night, trying to find words to describe the pain he felt. I didn't know what I was doing," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I just wanted to have fun, and now she's gone. And her children, they'll never see her again." Laura looked at him, her expression a mix of compassion and sadness. "Jake, you need to understand that you can't carry this weight alone. The guilt you feel is normal, but it won't change what happened." He shook his head, feeling lost. "What if I can't forgive myself? What if I never can forget?" "Then you need to learn to live with it," she said with a firm look. "You can't change the past, but you can try to do something good with it in the future." Jake closed his eyes, absorbing her words, but still felt trapped in a cycle of regret and pain. He knew his life would never be the same. And as he talked with Laura, the reality that redemption might be unattainable began to set in. The courtroom was packed, the chairs creaking under the weight of the gravity of the moment. Jake Thompson sat in the front row, his heart pounding with almost unbearable intensity. He looked at the faces around him, each one carrying a story of pain and loss, and wondered how he had reached this point. The white walls were like a reflection of his life, empty and cold. He was about to hear what could be the sentence of his existence, and the thought terrified him. When the judge entered, a reverent silence fell over the room. The formality of the moment seemed to suffocate him. Jake's defense attorney began presenting the arguments, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts of Sarah Miller, the woman whose life he had destroyed in a fraction of a second. He recalled her face, the way she smiled while pushing her children in the park, and the image of her life being taken in an instant consumed him. The first witness called was a friend of Sarah's, who stood up with his gaze fixed on Jake. She was an incredible mother, always putting her children first. He began, his voice choked with emotion. "When we heard what happened, the pain was unbearable. My children lost a friend, and I lost a part of myself." He looked directly at Jake, his words like stabs. "You have no idea what you've done." Jake wanted to hide, wanted to shrink into that chair and disappear. He felt a lump in his throat, but he couldn't look away. "I'm sorry," he murmured, even though he knew those words were empty. He had apologized so many times, and none of them brought Sarah back. The testimonies continued, each one more painful than the last. Sarah's sister took the stand and with tears in her eyes, shared childhood memories, moments when Sarah dreamed of being a mother. She always wanted to give her children the best. And you took that from her. The words echoed in Jake's mind, the guilt becoming an unbearable weight that seemed to crush him. At the end of the day, Jake felt that the whole room was against him. He stood up, feeling an urge to speak, to explain himself. I didn't want this to happen. I was drunk. I can't believe that. I took her life. His voice faltered and he sat down again, his face hot with shame. That night Jake couldn't sleep. He wandered around the house, every corner filled with memories that now seemed to haunt him. He decided that he needed to do something, that he should find a way to redeem himself. The idea of acts of charity seemed the only way to ease the pain he felt, even though he knew nothing could erase what he had done. The next morning, Jake went to the community center and offered to organize an event in Sarah's memory, a fundraiser to help single mothers. If I can help in some way, maybe I can pay a little for what I've done, he thought, convincing himself that it was a step in the right direction. However, when the event arrived, Jake realized that the people were there for Sarah, not for him. He stood in a corner, watching the sadness on the faces of those who knew the real story. I just want to help, he murmured to himself, as he tried to blend in with the crowd, but felt like a spectator in his own life. Weeks passed, and the pressure of responsibilities and the weight of guilt became more intense. One night, in a moment of weakness, Jake found himself back in a bar, the familiar environment surrounding him like a treacherous embrace. He ordered a beer, and when the golden liquid arrived at his table, he felt a wave of temporary relief. Just this time, he thought, but the promises he made to himself were just whispers lost in the noise of the world around him. As the night progressed, Jake let himself be carried away by the drink, each sip a reminder of his inability to deal with the guilt. He no longer wanted to think about Sarah, her children, the life he had destroyed. The last time, I promise, he murmured between forced laughs, but he already knew that his promise was as empty as the bottles piling up on the table. Reality surrounded him, but he refused to see it. Jake listened to the echo of his own heartbeat as he waited for the sentence. Sitting in the hard chair of the courtroom, the weight of responsibility crushed him. The judge, an austere and impassive figure, looked at him through his glasses, and the words that came out of his mouth seemed to resonate like a bell of condemnation. Jake Thompson, you have been found guilty of manslaughter. The magistrate's voice became a distant murmur as Jake lost himself in his thoughts. Images of Sarah, her interrupted life, and the faces of her children filled his mind. The reality of what he had done finally set in, and Jake felt his stomach turn. An intense cold spread through his body as he heard the sentence being pronounced. You are sentenced to 5 years in prison. As he left the courtroom, Jake's life became a blur. He was taken to the penitentiary, where routine would become his new normal. In the first few days, loneliness enveloped him like a heavy cloak. The space was small, and the silence that surrounded him was almost palpable. He sat at a table in the cafeteria, watching the other inmates interacting with each other. The conversations were shallow, but each laugh and each moment of camaraderie reminded him of the life he had left behind. Hey, aren't you the one who killed the woman in the accident, right? A robust-looking man approached, with a sarcastic smile on his lips. Jake felt anger bubbling inside him, but guilt kept him on the sidelines. So, are you just going to sit there feeling sorry for yourself, or are you going to do something with your life? The man continued, apparently enjoying the situation. I don't want to talk to you, Jake replied, his voice low and trembling. Oh, but you need to. Life here isn't easy, and if you don't connect with others, you'll end up getting even more lost. Jake looked at the man, searching for some sign of understanding, but found only contempt. He got up and left the cafeteria, seeking a more isolated place to take refuge. In the prison library, Jake found a quiet corner, where books became his escape. He devoured pages, seeking answers, a way to understand the pain he had caused, and how he could prevent others from going down the same path. Over time, Jake began to open up to other prisoners. He listened to stories of lives destroyed by wrong choices, by addictions, and by situations that seemed uncontrollable. In a moment of sincerity, a young man named Alex shared his story. "I was so immature. I did things I shouldn't have done. Now I'm here and I can't change the past," Alex said, his eyes filled with tears. "I feel the same way," Jake replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Causing someone's death. It's something I'll never be able to forget. But you can use it to change something to help others," Alex suggested, with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "If you manage to get out of here one day, maybe you can make a difference." Alex's words echoed in Jake's mind, and as the days turned into weeks, he began to reflect on the possibility of redemption. During rehabilitation meetings, Jake set out to listen to others, to share his story, and to connect in a way he never had before. He realized that, although guilt consumed him, he could turn his pain into something constructive. In one of those meetings, Jake found a mentor who inspired him to see beyond himself. True change comes from repentance and the desire to do good. You need to understand that although you can't change the past, you can shape your future, said the man, with a firm and encouraging voice. Over time, Jake began to plan how he could help young people avoid the same mistakes he had made. He dreamed of creating a program that talked about traffic responsibility, about the consequences of choices. This idea motivated him to try harder in rehabilitation courses, to become a better person, at least for himself. As he looked out the window of his cell, Jake saw the open sky and felt that, even behind bars, there was a light of hope. He was determined to become the voice that would warn others about the dangers of alcohol and recklessness. If he could save just one life, perhaps the pain he carried could, in some way, be worth it. Jake Thompson took a deep breath as he stepped out of prison. The air outside felt different, almost heavier. He had spent years locked up, reflecting on his choices, and now, finally having the opportunity to do something meaningful. A mix of hope and fear enveloped him. He felt he was about to begin a new phase in his life, but the weight of guilt still accompanied him, like an unwanted shadow. Determined to turn his pain into purpose, Jake joined an NGO that worked with young people, promoting road safety. The first talk he gave was at a local school, and he was nervous. The auditorium was full, and the curious faces of the teenagers watched him attentively. He sat at the table, staring at the audience, and began to speak. "Hi everyone. My name is Jake, and I'm here to share a story. A story about choices. Some of them may seem small, but they can have devastating consequences." His voice trembled slightly, but he continued, remembering what he had learned in prison. "I used to think I was in control, that nothing could go wrong. But one night I made a choice that changed my life forever." The teenagers listened in silence, some whispering to each other, but most seemed attentive. Jake talked about that fateful night, the sound of the beer being poured, the feeling of invincibility, and the distraction that led him to send a text message while driving. The weight of his story began to become evident in the air, and he saw some heads lowering, as if the reality he was describing was beginning to penetrate their minds. "I took the life of a woman, a mother of 2 children, and every day since then has been a reminder of the pain I caused. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think of her and her family." Jake paused, feeling the tears welling up in his eyes. "There are no excuses that can erase what I did, but I'm here to tell you that you have the power to make different choices." When the talk was over, some students approached him, and a young man with disheveled hair stood out. "Jake, I understood what you said. I also like to go out with my friends and sometimes drink. But do you think I can really change?" Jake looked into the boy's eyes, recognizing the insecurity that resided there. "You can, yes. The choice is always yours. And you can surround yourself with people who support you in doing the right thing. It's easy to get carried away by pressure, but always think about the consequences. One wrong decision can change everything." After the talk, Jake felt energized. He was making a difference, even if on a small scale. But his joy was short-lived. A few days later, he received a message that left him paralyzed. It was from Emily, Sarah's wife. With a knot in his stomach, he opened the message. "Jake, I hope you're doing well. I have something sad to tell you. One of the boys you helped, Lucas, was involved in an accident last night. He was trying to imitate what you said you did, and now he's no longer with us. The children grew up without their mother, and now they've lost a friend. The pain never ends." Emily's words echoed in his mind, a devastating blow that made him feel as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He sank into his couch, tears streaming down his face. The search for redemption he had believed he was pursuing now seemed empty, like an echo in a desolate valley. He had tried to make a difference, but he had also failed. Jake knew he could never make up for the pain he had caused. Life was marked by irreversible choices, and he was trapped in a cycle of regret. Emily's message reminded him that the weight of his actions was not just his own, but that of everyone around him. He looked out the window, the horizon stretching before him, but the future seemed bleak. The struggle for redemption now seemed like an insurmountable mountain, and as he remembered the lives that had been affected, Jake felt that the path to peace was longer than he could ever imagine.
And so, we conclude another story here on Radio Life Stories. Jake Thompson's journey is a powerful reminder of how our choices, no matter how small they may seem, can have deep and lasting consequences. As we listen to Jake's story, we're led to reflect on the fragility of life and the importance of responsibility in every action we take. How many times do we get carried away by a sense of invincibility, believing that nothing bad can happen to us? But as we've seen, it only takes a moment of distraction for everything to change, for lives to be irreversibly affected. Jake sought redemption, but he discovered that the road to forgiveness is long and full of obstacles. However, his story also shows us that even when it seems there's no turning back, we can still find ways to do good, to turn our pain into something constructive. Let this story serve as a warning and an inspiration. May we learn to value our moments more and to think about the consequences of our choices. And above all, may we have the courage to acknowledge our mistakes and seek a path to redemption, no matter how difficult it may be. Take this reflection with you and remember, sometimes we think it's just a story, but when we realize it, we're talking about our own lives. Until next time, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, comment, like, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message.